When my HOA banned me from stepping outside after 8 p.m., I laughed. When they fined me $100 for getting my mail, I got angry. When they tried to control my entire life, I fought back. They had no idea what they just unleashed. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Let me tell you about the time my HOA tried to control my life and ended up regretting it big time. I'm Sarah, 28 years old, and I thought buying my first house in Maple Grove Estates would be a dream come true. Boy, was I wrong. It all started 3 months after I moved in. I was coming home from my evening jog around 8:30 p.m. when Mrs. Henderson, the HOA president, stopped me at my driveway. She's one of those people who thinks wearing a blazer makes her look important, but really just makes her look like she's trying too hard. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said, holding a clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. I pulled out my earbuds, still catching my breath. "Sure, what's up?" The HOA board has received several complaints about residents being out and about after dark. For safety reasons, we're implementing a new rule effective immediately. I laughed, thinking she was joking. What kind of rule? Her face was dead serious. No residents are allowed outside their homes after 8 p.m. without prior written approval from the board. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You're kidding, right? This isn't prison, Mrs. Henderson. I'm an adult who pays taxes and owns this house. The rule applies to everyone, no exceptions. We've already sent out notices." She handed me a fancy letter with the HOA letterhead. Failure to comply will result in fines starting at $100 for the first violation. I read the letter twice, my jaw dropping further with each word. They actually wanted to implement a curfew in a neighborhood of grown adults. In America. "This is insane," I said. "What if I have to work late? What if there's an emergency? What if I just want to get groceries?" Mrs. Henderson adjusted her glasses. "You can submit a written request 48 hours in advance for any necessary after-hours activities. The board will review it and provide approval if deemed appropriate." Deemed appropriate? By who? You. I could feel my blood pressure rising. By the elected board, yes. We're responsible for maintaining order and safety in this community. I crumpled the letter and threw it in my trash can right in front of her. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You can't legally enforce this." "Actually, we can. Check your HOA agreement. Section 12.3 gives us authority to implement safety measures as needed." She smiled, that fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Have a pleasant evening, Sarah. And remember, no more outdoor activities after 8 p.m. That night, I stayed up until 2 a.m. reading my HOA agreement with a magnifying glass. Sure enough, buried in the fine print was a clause about emergency safety protocols that gave the board broad powers. I couldn't believe I'd signed this thing without a lawyer. The next evening, I decided to test their resolve. At 8:15 p.m., I walked to my mailbox. It's literally 20 feet from my front door. Before I could even open it, a flashlight beam hit me. "Ma'am, step away from the mailbox." I turned to see Bob Martinez, another board member, approaching with what looked like a security guard uniform he'd bought online. "Bob, it's me, Sarah. I'm getting my mail. It's after 8 p.m. You're in violation of community safety protocols." I couldn't help but laugh. "Bob, you work at the hardware store. Last week you helped me pick out door handles. Now you're playing security guard. This isn't a game, Sarah. The board is serious about enforcement." "Fine." I grabbed my mail and headed back inside, but not before saying, "You know this is crazy, right? Even you have to see how insane this is." Bob's expression softened for just a moment. "Look, Sarah, I don't love it either, but Mrs. Henderson says we had 3 break-ins last month. We're just trying to keep everyone safe." 3 break-ins? In broad daylight or at night? Well, during the day actually. But still. "So you're banning nighttime activities to prevent daytime break-ins?" Bob opened his mouth, then closed it. I could see the gears turning in his head. 2 days later, I got my first fine. $100 for unauthorized evening outdoor activity. The violation: walking to my car at 8:05 p.m. because I'd forgotten my work laptop. That's when I decided to fight back. I started by doing research. Turns out, HOA curfews are extremely rare and often legally questionable. Most states require HOA rules to be reasonable, and most courts don't consider adult curfews reasonable. But I needed more than legal research. I needed community support. I spent the next week talking to my neighbors during the day, when we were allowed to be outside. The responses were eye-opening. Mrs. Chin, who lived 3 houses down, whispered like we were planning a revolution. "I think it's terrible, but I'm scared to speak up." Mrs. Henderson controls everything around here. Tom from the corner house was more direct. It's complete garbage, Sarah. I've been meaning to say something, but I work 2 jobs and don't have time for HOA drama. Jennifer, the nurse who worked night shifts, was furious. I get home at 2 a.m. every day. Am I supposed to teleport from my car to my house? Young couple Mark and Lisa were the most interesting. We actually moved here to get away from our last HOA. Now this one's worse than the old one. By the end of the week, I'd talked to 47 of the 52 houses in our neighborhood. Only 3 people supported the curfew and 2 of them were board members. Armed with this information, I requested to speak at the next HOA board meeting. The meeting was held in Mrs. Henderson's living room, which should have been my first red flag. 5 board members sat around her dining table like they were running a corporation instead of managing a small neighborhood. Sarah, you have 5 minutes, Mrs. Henderson announced, not bothering to look up from her papers. Thank you. I'm here to address the new curfew rule, which I believe is unreasonable, unenforceable, and frankly, un-American. Board member Janet rolled her eyes. Here we go with the dramatics. I ignored her. I've spoken with 47 households in our community. 44 oppose this rule. That's 94% of residents. We don't govern by popularity contest, Mrs. Henderson said. We govern by safety and common sense. Common sense? Let me read you some of the situations this rule creates. I pulled out my notes. Jennifer Martinez works as an ER nurse. Her shift ends at 2 a.m. According to your rule, she needs written permission to walk from her car to her house after work. She can park in her garage, Bob suggested. She doesn't have a garage, Bob. Neither do 18 other houses in this neighborhood. The board members looked at each other uncomfortably. I continued. Tom Wilson has teenagers who play sports. Their games often end after 8 p.m. Are you going to fine them for coming home? Minors are exempt, Mrs. Henderson said quickly. Where does it say that in the rule? I've read it 15 times. I held up their letter. It says residents. Teenagers are residents. More uncomfortable shuffling. Here's my favorite, I said, warming up. Mrs. Patterson, who's 73 years old, takes her dog out for a final bathroom break at 8:30 p.m. every night. She's done this for 8 years. Are you really going to fine a senior citizen for walking her arthritic dog to the nearest tree? She can adjust her schedule, Mrs. Henderson said, but her voice was getting smaller. Or, I said, standing up, you could admit this rule is ridiculous and repeal it. We will not be intimidated by threats, Janet announced. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm pointing out that this rule makes no sense, has no community support, and probably isn't legal. Mrs. Henderson stood up too. Legal? Are you threatening to sue us? I'm not threatening anything. I'm stating facts. But if you want to keep this rule, I'll do whatever I need to do to protect my rights as a homeowner. The room went quiet. You could hear the grandfather clock in the corner ticking. Your 5 minutes are up, Mrs. Henderson finally said. I left that meeting knowing they weren't going to back down easily. But I also knew I was right, and more importantly, I had the community behind me. The next evening, I decided to really test their enforcement. At exactly 8:01 p.m., I walked outside and started watering my front garden with a hose. Within 3 minutes, Bob appeared with his flashlight and clipboard. Sarah, you're in violation again. I'm watering my plants, Bob. It's after 8 p.m. The plants don't care what time it is. They need water. You could water them earlier. I turned off the hose and faced him. Bob, do you hear yourself? You're telling me when I'm allowed to water my own plants on my own property that I own. Bob shifted uncomfortably. Look, Sarah, I'm just doing my job. Your job? You're not getting paid for this. You're volunteering to harass your neighbors. I'm keeping the community safe. From what? From me watering petunias? Bob looked around like he was hoping for backup. Mrs. Henderson says if we don't enforce the rules consistently, they become meaningless. Bob, can I ask you something honestly? He nodded. Do you actually think this rule makes sense? He was quiet for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, no. Then why are you enforcing it? Because Mrs. Henderson says we have to. And what happens if you don't? Another long pause. I don't know. She's been HOA president for 6 years. Nobody questions her. Maybe somebody should. I could see something clicking in Bob's eyes. Sarah, what are you thinking? I'm thinking maybe it's time for new leadership around here. The next day I started my real campaign. I printed flyers and put them on every door in the neighborhood. Tired of being treated like children? Join us Thursday at 7 p.m. at Riverside Park for a community meeting about our HOA. Let's talk about reasonable rules for reasonable people. Sarah Mitchell, 412 Maple Drive. Mrs. Henderson was at my door within 2 hours. This is completely inappropriate, she said, waving my flyer. What's inappropriate about community members discussing community issues? You're undermining the authority of the elected board. I'm exercising my right to free speech and assembly. On HOA business. I smiled. Mrs. Henderson, the HOA doesn't own me. I can talk to my neighbors whenever I want, wherever I want, about whatever I want. Her face was getting red. We'll see about that. Thursday evening, I got to Riverside Park at 6:30 p.m. to set up. By 7 p.m., 38 people had shown up. That's more than had ever attended an official HOA meeting. I kept it simple. We're here because we're tired of unreasonable rules made by people who seem to forget we're all adults. Tonight, let's talk about what we want our neighborhood to be. The conversation that followed was incredible. People shared stories I'd never heard. The Johnsons had been fined $200 for painting their front door forest green instead of the approved earth green. The Williamses got a violation notice for having their Christmas lights up on January 2nd. 3 families had been fined for having cars parked in their own driveways overnight. But the curfew was the last straw for everyone. I feel like I'm living under martial law, said Jennifer, the night shift nurse. I can't believe I moved from my parents' house to have someone else tell me when I can go outside, added Mark, the young husband. Mrs. Chin, who was usually so quiet, stood up and said, In my home country we had curfews during wartime. I didn't come to America to have curfews in peacetime. The whole park went silent. Then someone started clapping and soon everyone was applauding. That's when I noticed Mrs. Henderson standing at the edge of the park with 2 other board members watching us. After the meeting, several people came up to me privately. Sarah, would you consider running for HOA president? We need someone who actually listens to the community. You've got my vote. I hadn't considered it before, but why not? The next election was in 3 months. It was time for change. The following morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The HOA was fining me $500 for organizing unauthorized gatherings on community business and inciting rebellion against lawful authority. Inciting rebellion? Really? I called my lawyer friend from college, Dave, and read him the letter. Sarah, he said, laughing, they can't fine you for talking to your neighbors. That's a clear First Amendment violation. So what should I do? Fight it? And document everything. If this goes to court, you want records of their overreach. That afternoon, I wrote a formal response to the HOA board. Dear board members, I am in receipt of your fine dated date regarding my community meeting. I respectfully dispute this fine on the following grounds. 1. I have the constitutional right to free speech and assembly. 2. I have the right to invite neighbors to discuss community issues. 3. The HOA has no authority to regulate my conversations with other residents. 4. Your fine is retaliatory and legally questionable. I will not be paying this fine. If you wish to pursue this matter, please contact my attorney. Sincerely, Sarah Mitchell. I hand-delivered copies to each board member. Mrs. Henderson called me that evening and she was furious. Sarah, you are way out of line. We have rules in this community. Yes, reasonable rules. Adult curfews aren't reasonable. The board has the authority to implement safety measures. Show me the safety data that supports this curfew. Silence. Mrs. Henderson, you said there were 3 break-ins that prompted this rule. When did they occur? I don't have to justify our decisions to you. Actually, you do. The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it. We are elected representatives. Elected by whom? There were 12 people at the last election. Out of 52 households. That's 23% turnout. More silence. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. I'm running for HOA president in the next election. And based on what I saw Thursday night, I think I'm going to win. We'll see about that, she said and hung up. The next few weeks were like living in a war zone. The board started issuing fines for everything. And my grass was 0.3 inches too long, $75. My mailbox post needed repainting, $50. And my car was parked improperly in my own driveway, $100. Other community members were getting hit too. It was clear the board was trying to intimidate people into submission. But it backfired spectacularly. Every ridiculous fine just made people angrier. Mrs. Chun got fined for having a small garden gnome that was non-approved lawn decoration. Tom got fined because his teenage son's friend parked on the street for 2 hours. People were calling me daily, "Sarah, this has to stop." When our elections. I organized another community meeting, this time at the community center we all paid for through HOA dues. 46 people showed up. "Here's the situation," I told them. "Elections are in 6 weeks. We need candidates for all 5 board positions. Who's interested in serving the community instead of controlling it?" 7 people volunteered immediately. Mrs. Henderson tried to crash our meeting halfway through. She walked in with Janet and Bob looking like she owned the place. "This unauthorized use of community facilities is unacceptable," she announced. The room went dead silent. I stood up slowly. "Mrs. Henderson, we reserved this space through the proper channels. We have a confirmation email. I didn't approve any reservation." Tom stood up from the back. "Since when does the HOA president personally approve community center reservations?" "Since always," she said, but her voice wavered. Jennifer, the nurse, stood up next. "Actually, the reservation system is first come, first served. It says so right on the website." Now half the room was standing. Mrs. Chen, bless her heart, walked right up to Mrs. Henderson. "You work for us. We don't work for you. Please leave." Mrs. Henderson looked around the room at 46 angry faces. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked scared. "This isn't over," she said, and left with her board members. The room erupted in cheers. Over the next month, our volunteer candidates went door to door talking to residents. Not campaigning aggressively, just listening to what people wanted from their HOA. The themes were consistent. Reasonable rules that make sense. Transparent decision-making. A respect for residents as adults. Focus on actual community improvements, not petty control. Meanwhile, the current board seemed to double down on their authoritarian approach. They sent out a letter warning residents about outside agitators trying to destroy community standards. They scheduled the election for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, clearly hoping working people couldn't attend. We countered by organizing carpools and encouraging people to take time off work. Several people offered to cover shifts for others so they could vote. Election day arrived. I got to the community center at 1:30 p.m. and couldn't believe what I saw. There was a line of 30 people waiting to vote. Mrs. Henderson was behind the registration table, looking increasingly nervous as more people showed up. By 2:30 p.m., 48 of 52 households had voted. It was the highest turnout in the neighborhood's history. They counted votes publicly as required. The results weren't even close. President: Sarah Mitchell 44 votes, Helen Henderson 4 votes. A Vice President: Tom Wilson 42 votes. Secretary: Jennifer Martinez 41 votes. Treasurer: Mrs. Chin 40 votes. At-large: Mark Johnson 39 votes. Mrs. Henderson was in shock. "This can't be right. We need a recount." "Ma'am," said the independent monitor we'd hired, 44 plus 4 equals 48. "The math is correct." The whole room started cheering again. My first act as HOA president was simple. I called an emergency board meeting for the next evening to repeal the curfew rule. It was unanimous, 5-0. But we didn't stop there. Over the next few months, we reduced annual dues by 20% by cutting unnecessary expenses. It simplified the rules from 47 pages to 12 pages of common-sense guidelines. It started monthly community BBQs in the park. Created a community garden where Mrs. Henderson's arbitrary flower restrictions used to be. Installed actual security cameras at entrances instead of relying on Bob's flashlight patrols. The transformation was incredible. People actually talked to each other now. Kids played in the streets again after 8 p.m. Jennifer could come home from work without fear of fines. Mrs. Henderson moved away 6 months later. At her going-away gathering, yes, we threw her a party because we're not vindictive. She actually apologized. "Sarah, I thought I was protecting the community, but I realized I was just controlling it. You've shown me what real leadership looks like." It was a classy move and I respected her for it. Bob stayed in the neighborhood and became one of our biggest supporters. He even helped install the community garden. "You know what the funny thing is?" he told me while we were planting tomatoes. "This place feels safer now than it did with all those rules." He was right. When people feel respected and heard, they naturally take better care of their community. Looking back, that stupid curfew rule was the best thing that ever happened to our neighborhood. It forced us to stand up for ourselves and remember that HOAs are supposed to serve residents, not rule them. These days I still go for evening jogs whenever I want. Sometimes neighbors join me. We chat about community projects, upcoming events, or just life in general. And every time I pass my mailbox after 8 p.m., I smile and remember the night this all started. The moral of the story? Sometimes the most ridiculous rules create the best opportunities for positive change. You just have to be willing to fight back. And trust me, they always regret it when you do.